Welcome, seekers of hidden knowledge, to the mystical realm of the occult. Delve into the secrets of the universe as we journey together into the enigmatic world of ancient wisdom. Brought to you by your guide through the shadows of enlightenment, Wisdom Rocker. Uncover the mysteries, unlock the power, and journey with us as we explore the hidden depths within the pages of forgotten scrolls and ancient texts. Prepare to embark on a journey beyond the ordinary, where wisdom transcends time and knowledge is your greatest ally. Welcome to Wisdom Rocker. Prepare to awaken your inner sage. In this video, we will be uncovering the wisdom within the chapters of
Lectures on Ancient Philosophy. Written by Manly P. Hall. Chapter 5. The Annihilation of the Sense of Diversity. The gods have already been defined as personifications of divine attributes, that is, they signify conditions of universal consciousness. Whereas the Absolute signifies all consciousness in suspension, the gods are differentiated phases of universal consciousness. While the ignorant venerate the gods either as personalities or divine beings, the philosopher recognizes them as cosmic planes or modes of realization. Thus, Buddha is to be regarded primarily as the condition of perfect illumination rather than as a personality. A subtle point is contained in the fact that he who attains to Buddhahood is not a Buddha but the Buddha. In other words, Buddha, like light, is an all-pervading state, and he who becomes luminous shines not with a separate light but rather is merged with the one light whose radiance is diffused throughout all worlds. In its ascent to source, consciousness is merged sequentially with ever higher universal aspects of itself, becoming one with each level or plane with which it is temporarily blended. These planes or levels, representing the various phases of expanding consciousness, form the concatenated order of the gods. Hades, for example, was the Greek god of death or, more explicitly, materiality. Accordingly, Hades represents the consciousness of materiality. Whoever moves and feels in terms of materiality is materiality, for we are what our consciousness is. The modern thinker would term the material-minded person a materialist. The esoterist, however, would say that the material-minded person is materiality. Again, the Western scholar considers a lawbreaker a criminal, whereas the Oriental thinks of the lawbreaker as crime. If, therefore, the Eastern sage conceives of crime as an individualized monster, then each criminal becomes not an individual expression of that monster but the actual monster itself. Hate, for example, can hardly be thought of as an individual, and yet it is definitely a state of consciousness, more correctly, unconsciousness. The Eastern mind cannot conceive of a number of entities each a separate condition of hatred, because the moment hatred is born in the human heart, the person who permits this condition to exist within himself becomes the embodiment of the plane of universal hatred. In other words, a universal condition is made manifest in that individual. Several men may hate at the same time in different parts of the world, yet there is but one consciousness of hatred with which they all hate. Hence this demon of hate may exist in more than one person simultaneously. During a great war millions may hate at the same time, yet each is neither a fraction of hatred nor simply manifesting hatred. Each is himself hate, and all who indulge this passion are identical with the nature of hatred. The multiform images of the Buddhists all signify extensions and modes of consciousness. As realization increases and the unfolding self grasps more and more of the infinite span, the symbols become ever more complex while the principles for which they stand become ever more simple. Frequently a number of arms are used to represent the metaphysical potencies. Thus, the consciousness of right judgment may be depicted as a hand holding some legal instrument. Similarly, the consciousness of priestly protection by another arm sustaining some implement of the priestcraft, the consciousness of rulership by still another arm elevating a crown or scepter, the consciousness of the good and just physician by a hand holding some instrument of surgery or healing herb, the consciousness of all-knowing by a hand holding a short staff or a scroll, and the consciousness of the divine avenger by a closed fist shaking a thunderbolt. A plurality of arms and heads thus becomes a method highly appropriate to symbolize the invisible but all-powerful qualities which the Chela during his development expresses through the depth of his own being. Whenever through self-unfoldment an individual attains to the state of consciousness symbolized by a certain God, then that God is declared to be incarnate in that personality and to actually walk the earth. Thus, the God of joy is incarnate in the joyful man, the God of mercy in the merciful, the God of truth in the truthful, and the God of war in those who fight. Being divine attributes, the gods thus become flesh in those mortal creatures who have unfolded and given expression within themselves to those godlike attributes. In the Temple of 10,000 Buddhas at Kyoto, Japan, are to be found numberless images of the Buddha and the attendant Bodhisattvas, or disciples of the Lord of Enlightenment. Perfection is represented in the form of the Buddha and the disciplines or ways of perfection in the forms of Bodhisattvas. The latter are the stages of enlightenment, the symbols of the sure and eternal path which winds through the illusion and leads ultimately to the attainment of perfect good. Dear to the heart of the East is the beloved Kwan-Yin, or Kwan-Non, the great Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the Oriental Madonna, commonly called the Goddess of Mercy. For centuries the Buddhist monks have striven in their meditations to blend their consciousness with this divinity of compassion, the merciful, enduring one. The artists' priests have loved to depict upon silk or carve in stone, wood, or ivory the form of this compassionate consciousness of protection. Kwan-Yin was originally a masculine figure, probably based upon an historical Buddha, presumably the second of the Great Line, but through the centuries the compassionate nature of Avalokitesvara is responsible for the gradual metamorphosis of the figure into a feminine divinity. In China and Japan, Kwan-Yin is usually a standing figure robed in graceful flowing garments with the face set in compassionate repose. Often the figure has only 2 arms, although a favorite number is 6. When shown with 6 arms, Kwan-Yin is generally seated with her head resting upon the palm of her hand. In Japan there are figures of the Kwan-Yin with as many as 1,000 arms to symbolize the universal scope of the Kwan-Yin consciousness. In Tibet the figure is often shown with 11 heads. Certain late Buddhist writings give definite philosophical meaning to numbers, so the multiplicity of members is of particular import. The poses of the various hands give a key to the exalted nature of Eastern mysticism. The mudras, or hand postures of the Buddha, constitute a secret science of which little is known to those not initiated into the Buddhist mysteries. The hand may be extended in an attitude of giving, which then signifies the consciousness of giving and which, when free from all terrestrial taint, gives an exquisite pleasure to the inner self. The joy of giving is a commendable state of consciousness, as is also the joy of receiving. All these joys are finally discarded, however, until but one remains, namely, the perfect bliss of contemplation of self. In Japan there is a lovable Buddhist divinity usually shown with a bald head and a benign countenance. This is Jizo, the god of little children. Because of his great love for helpless child souls, Jizo has become their patron and protector. When a baby dies, according to the Japanese legend, it wanders in a gloomy cavern awaiting rebirth, where it has for its only task the heaping up of little piles of stones. In his Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, Lafcadio Hearn describes the cave of the children's souls where flows the legendary fountain of milk from which the dead children drink and where in the gloom sits the smiling Jizo. When the evil spirits frighten them, the loving Jizo extends his arms and the children's souls all run and hide in the sleeves of his kimono. It is evident that Jizo signifies not only the consciousness of the love of children but also, in a more lofty sense, that consciousness which, Having elevated itself to the heights of realization and gazing down upon unknowing humanity, realizes all creatures to be but little children piling up heaps of stones. Whether these piles be in the distant Japanese cave of Kaka or the stone heaps of a great city, Jizo gazes with boundless compassion upon infant humanity. When the monsters of war, greed and lust frighten the ignorant and immature, he then extends his arms and like the Master Jesus brooding over Jerusalem longs to gather the weak and helpless under the protection of his flowing robes. The God Jizo is incarnate in those in whom love for the weak and desire to serve the helpless springs from a true realization of that which must be accomplished. Jizo is a principle and those possessing and manifesting this principle are one with him in his labor of love. In the Tushita heaven of the Lamas dwells the radiant consciousness of Maitreya, the loving one, the desired of all nations, the Buddhist Messiah who is yet to come. This Bodhisattva is the personification of man's hope of ultimate achievement. He signifies the eternal tomorrow, the time of all accomplishment. Robed in futurity, he is the consciousness of noble destiny. At the Lama temple in Peking is to be seen a gigantic figure of Jampa, Maitreya, whose gilt-lacquered body dazzles the beholder with its brilliance and whose expressionless face gazes down upon the altar 70 feet below. Maitreya gives a definite key to the worldwide belief in a coming Savior whose advent will be marked by miracles and who shall lead his people to spiritual and temporal victory. Maitreya is the consciousness of hope, and he comes to those who can sense, even abstractly, the existence of a nobler and more illumined state. According to popular superstition, the advent of Maitreya, like the 10th avatar of Vishnu, will be a particular and definite occurrence. In reality, however, Maitreya is continually manifesting as the circumstances that lead worlds, nations, and individuals up along the path of the law to final absorption with the Absolute. Maitreya saves the world by revealing to the world that it is capable of salvation, for out of the realization of possible perfection is born the hope and strength to persevere. Maitreya is therefore the embodiment of Dharma, and he who accepts the law shall be saved by the law. Jesus, another personification of the law, assured his followers that those who believed in him should not perish. Maitreya is the way, the truth and the life which, coming to every life, redeems all who accept it. In dealing with the subject of consciousness, it is possible to conceive of reality as permeating the entire area of space and gradually contracting itself toward the center, thereby limiting itself in the establishment of unreality. Or, on the other hand, consciousness may be regarded as occupying a central point from which it radiates itself throughout all being, pouring its effulgence into the abyss of the not-self, which is thereby redeemed. The Kabbalists reconciled both these viewpoints by affirming that Ein Sof, the Absolute, first retired from the circumference to the center to establish the illusion and then diffused itself over the area private by its first withdrawal, thus, re-establishing reality. The Ptolemaic system of astronomy, though untrue from a scientific point of view, clarifies one of the esoteric teachings of ancient learning so long misconstrued by modern scholars. By placing the Earth in the center of the solar system and dividing the interval between the Earth and the inner wall of the heavens by a number of planes corresponding to the orbits of the planetary bodies, a diagrammatic figure of consciousness and its extensions is created. Outside the orbit of the Earth were the spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn in the order noted. Beyond the sphere of Saturn was the plane of the constellations which formed the inner surface of the zodiacal globe. Outside this globe was the empyrean, or dwelling place of the gods. The mysteries taught that man must ascend in realization from the earth through the rings, or planes, of the planets to the circle of the zodiac. Having reached the wall of heaven, he was then to break through and enter the supreme universe. After realization has pierced the crystalline shell of being, it then ceases to be under the jurisdiction of the governors of the 7 planets and the vast body of cosmic agencies controlling all mundane creations. The student, however, should not conceive of his consciousness as rising but rather of his inferior self ascending through various levels of consciousness to ultimate union with the all-knowing. This idea requires further amplification. What man pleases to call his spirit is, in reality, the level of self to which he is attuned by the quality and completeness of his realization. The Oriental symbolizes universal self as an immense sunburst, its inconceivably magnificent center surrounded by innumerable rings of petal-like emanations, which decrease in brilliancy as they recede from the center. This sunburst fills all conceivable space, extending from up to down and from in to out, and each of its petals, or rays, supports, in the sense of being the causal nature of, a definite genus of so-called evolving life. Thus, the infinite diversity of manifestation reflects the infinite potentialities of the causal nature. The question may properly be asked how the self, though an absolute unity and hence incapable of diversity, can still exist in a number of apparently different states. To employ a simple analogy, let us take 2 goblets, one containing wine and the other water. The wine will symbolize self, the water, the illusionary universe of privation of the self, the abyss of the German mystics. If a small quantity of the wine be poured into the water, the wine will undergo no actual change, yet it will be so diluted as to be apparently different from its original state. Then imagine all the wine to be divided into single drops which are allowed to fall into the water one at a time. Each drop will cause a minute but definite difference in the degree of dilution and, consequently, the wine will exist in as many conditions as there are degrees of dilution. Yet the wine will actually undergo no change, and regardless of how much water is added it will still remain a single substance. Thus, the infinite diversity of manifestation has its origin not in separate spiritual agencies but in the conditions which the self is capable of assuming in relation to its own absence. In East Indian philosophy the human figure is substituted for the earth, otherwise, the Ptolemaic system of the planets is preserved, the outermost orbit becoming the boundary of limitation that separates the individual from the universal state. Sitting in meditation in the midst of his little universe, the philosopher by definite projection of the faculties of realization annihilates one by one the walls that enclose him until finally with one supreme effort he shatters the globe of his individuality and achieves nirvana. Let us try to conceive the process whereby the mystic transcends all environment and becomes en rapport with universal principles, recognizing in the orbits of the planets certain major levels of realization. It soon becomes evident that the mind per se is unable to cope with the situation, for in spiritual concerns the intellect is well-nigh powerless. In an effort to explain simply the theory, let us presume that the earth in the center of the Ptolemaic chart represents the state of absolute ignorance and the empyrean beyond the circle of the zodiac, absolute wisdom or consciousness. Humanity numbers in its ranks many so-called worldly wise men, powerful intellects thickly encrusted with the catalogued notions and superstitions of others. Since all material knowledge is added on from without, under the stress of desperate need the inner nature is discovered to be incapable of sustaining the intellectual conceits thus foisted upon it. On the other hand, realization is a power which has its source within the inner nature itself. Like the balm of Gilead, it brings with it peace, courage and understanding. It tinctures the outer nature with a spiritual comprehension, giving an intuitive grasp of facts and the power to discern reality. It may therefore be stated that the fundamental difference between knowledge and understanding lies in the direction of the flow of power, knowledge flowing in from without and understanding flowing out from within. Realization is consequently a problem of the inner life and can receive little assistance from the outer nature. The mind creates elaborate theologies and intricate systems of reasoning which are without other than intellectual foundation, and in moments of dire need it is all too apparent that these adumbrations lack the substance of sufficiency. Hence, to convert an individual by outer means is useless, for true conversion can only come through the inner realization of certain divine or natural facts. To affirm oneself to occupy a certain position in the universe means nothing, but to realize the nature of a certain position or condition is to be one with that condition or to occupy that position. While Ptolemy knew that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, he also knew that earthiness was the beginning point of all achievement and that each struggling creature rising from its own earthiness must ascend through the circles of realization to eventually achieve complete liberation from the grossness of inferior nature. Seated in the midst of the circles and separated from the universal self by 7 great walls of limitation of consciousness, the unillumined nature dwells in a state of isolation, accepting in its ignorance the illusion of diversity and regarding all creation as conspiring to bring about its destruction. Man must attain the realization necessary for his liberation by one of 2 paths. 1. He must follow the apparently endless spiral of life which leads in and through creation and eventually brings him to realization through experience. This experience is largely the essence of the reactions of joy and sorrow together with the recognition of the sequence of cause and effect in all the incidents of life. 2. By the Dharma of realization, the disciple may so intensify his attitudes through philosophic discipline as to achieve in a comparatively brief period of time that which the mass of humanity must attain by the slower and more circuitous route of natural processes. Through realization alone can the great work be consummated. Only he who possesses realization is able to dispel the illusion of diversity. The true magnitude of an individual is measured by both the intensiveness and extensiveness of his realization, for the individual extends in every direction as far as his realization is capable of penetrating. For example, in his least illumined state man is but a mere speck in the midst of universal expanse. In his most illumined state, however, man has so increased in rational magnitude that universal expanse becomes a mere speck within his realization. In his ignorance man conceives the universe as including him, only to ultimately discover that his divine potentialities are so boundless that, when adequately manifested, the universe and countless vistas unmeasured are but infinitesimal parts of his own being. In Pythagorean terminology, man in his relapsed states conceives himself to be one of many, only to find upon arrival at the fullness of understanding that he has encircled the many and resolved them into his own unity. The figure seated in the rings represents the mystic directionalizing his realization upon the eternal. By this process he recapitulates the entire scheme of universal unfoldment and reveals the causal urge behind all racial and individual development. In the diagram the rings are numbered from 1 to 7. The first ring immediately surrounds the seated form of the sage and the area thus, enclosed by it, being the smallest division, signifies the most limited state of realization. Those whose poverty of realization restricts them to this level of consciousness may be considered ignorant to the degree of the savage. Here the life is ruled by fear and hatred, fear of the unknown and hatred for that which possesses superior knowledge. With crude implements and cruder instincts these unknowing ones seek to fulfill nature's first law, self-preservation. The finer emotions and sentiments are entirely absent, and the organic quality of the body is so low that the capacity for physical pain is thereby reduced to a minimum. Understanding is totally lacking, but in its place is a certain primitive cunning which warns of danger and instructs in the rudiments of physical survival. Little or no effort is made by this type to communicate its attitudes or feeling to others. It does not establish any definite communal life, but lives by itself and for itself alone and finally creeps away to die, leaving its unburied bones to bleach upon some wind-blown crag. Though civilization has reached practically every corner of the earth and savage tribes are fast vanishing before its advance, it is possible to veneer the exterior and still leave the interior nature as primitive as ever. The addition of a Prince Albert coat or a pair of spats does not necessarily result in a highly advanced degree of culture, for many people suspected of considerable refinement are still innately barbaric. In fact, all who advocate isolated individualism are reverting to aboriginal type. Whenever the activities of life are centered exclusively upon the aggrandizement of the lesser self, such an attitude is unfailing evidence of the survival of crook-bone traits, where the individual is completely wrapped up in himself, feels himself sufficient for himself and regards all humanity as legitimate prey for exploitation. We have definite proof that his consciousness is still limited to the narrow confines of the first ring. The universe beyond means nothing to him, for beyond his realization it has no existence. When the meditating sage elevates his realization until it recognizes the insufficiency of such a code and can no longer live in this sense of utter separateness, then the first ring is said to be annihilated and the realization sweeps outward to meet the limiting confines of the second ring. The circle of realization has thus been considerably enlarged and the self has taken the first step to escape from the not-self. As growth is synonymous with increasing inclusiveness, the individual functioning upon the level of consciousness of the second ring accepts into himself a limited number of external objects. In the dawn of civilization, the family was lifted to a certain degree of equality with the individual who constituted himself its head. Such an individual still viewed the world as hostile, but out of it he chose a few and these he accepted on a parity with himself. His sense of protection included them, his love of self regarded them as part of himself and consequently legitimate objects for his affection. To a certain degree he viewed the members of his family as possessions, but psychologically he possessed them because his realization included them, for nothing can be actually possessed unless it is enclosed by the realization of possession. There is to be found in human nature an inherent trait which causes each individual to feel himself to be different from any other living thing and consequently superior to and free from the laws governing the body of creation. In this ring the individual rises to that state of consciousness where he decides that those of his immediate circle upon whom he confers his affections are likewise composed of this superior substance and, like himself, differ from the rest of society. However, the fact that even one or two are included with self demonstrates that the annihilation of the sense of diversity has begun, for as the self accepts into itself that which was previously a stranger to it, the cosmic march toward unity begins and continues until all existence has thus been absorbed. Today there are millions of people whose spiritual natures are the substance of the second ring. They will cheat the world that they may lavish their ill-gotten gains upon their own family circle. Humanity at large is still a stranger to them. Their realization fails to recognize in all mankind the common heritage of similar loves, hopes, fears and aspirations. This particular thought brings to mind the plea of Shylock in the third act of The Merchant of Venice for scattered and downtrodden Israel. By taking a few liberties with Shylock's speech, a truth is established beyond the conception of those whose realization limits them to the consciousness of the second ring. Have not all men eyes, have not all men hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, are not all men fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same summer and winter as you are? If you prick them, do they not bleed? If you tickle them, do they not laugh? If you poison them, do they not die? To summarize, the consciousness of the second ring covers blood relations and those upon whom particular affections are lavished, the mother, father, husband, wife and child. These are accepted as parts of self and the work of unification has been inaugurated, for while in the first ring these are 5 separate people, In the second ring they are included as members of the one in whom the realization of their proximity has been established. When realization increases to the point where it includes the stranger without the gate, the spirit of friendship is born. A friend is one to whom we are related by consciousness rather than by blood. Pythagoras declared his friend to be his alter ego, his other self. At another time he stated friendship to be that condition in which one soul existed in two bodies, thereby elevating this relationship far above that of the ties of blood. Until realization reaches the third plane, friendship is impossible because up to that point egotism is so dominant a motive that man's love for himself precludes all other affections. When realization annihilates the substances of the second ring and flows through into its enlarged field of expression, the tribal, later the national, spirit is evolved. A certain clannishness is manifested, for though the great world without is still excluded, nevertheless the sense of inclusiveness has been increased to take in those having a similar origin or living in close proximity. Having one leader, the tribe is simply an enlarged family, the chief or head symbolizing the father, for nearly all tribal forms of government are patriarchies. Eventually the tribe grows into the nation and there is born a curious mental attitude termed patriotism. Patriotism is merely an accentuated egotism which embraces the members of the tribe or nation to which the egotist himself belongs. Fundamentally it is based upon the belief that that of which the individual is a part, is, like himself, incapable of wrong. Consequently, all examination of motive is regarded as superfluous, and the attitude that I and mine are right and you and yours are wrong is an attitude to be assumed and maintained at all costs. Long regarded as a virtue, patriotism will yet demonstrate itself to be a most pernicious attitude, for it can be and has been controlled and directionalized by personal interest, frequently to tragic ends. To affirm that an individual can do no wrong merely because he is of the same blood or clan as oneself and to defend him because of such relationship is a fault and contributes to his own moral delinquency and the destruction of the nation. There can be but one true patriotism, namely, patriotism to principle. But those dwelling in the consciousness of the third ring are as yet unaware of principle, and to them their tribe or nation is elevated to a position approximating deity. Yet with all his faults and blindness, the one who has attained to this degree of consciousness has gone far in the mastery of diversity, for his realization has increased until in part, at least, it has included an entire nation within the range of common interest. True, it has not yet learned to understand the structure and consciousness of nations, but this comes later. Here is the man who will die for his friend but cannot possibly understand his friend, for he serves not the consciousness of his friend but rather his own preconceived standard of friendship. It may therefore be said, regardless of the actual integrity of the friend himself, that he dies nor for his friend but for his own concept of friendship. Man creates standards and later serves them as though they were divine creations, only to discover ultimately that deity had no hand in their fashioning. When the sage, seated in the midst of his rings of consciousness, elevates his realization to the sphere of the fourth ring, he passes from national to racial concerns. His ever-increasing vista of understanding has revealed to him that the inhabitants of Earth are not merely isolated individuals nor even families and tribes, but rather can be classified under a few racial headings. It naturally follows that the mind establishes comparisons between the relative superiority of these races, also, that the unillumined man should upon some pretext or other elevate the particular race of which he is a part to the position of superiority. If at the time of making the comparison his own nation occupies a position that is evidently inferior, he will philosophize upon their past glory or dream of their future ascendancy. Such an individual, however, continues to annihilate diversity, For in his analysis of peoples he no longer conceives of 1.5 billion separate units but rather of a score of major segments, each composed of a vast number of lesser parts. From this attitude is born the racial spirit. We have chosen peoples and rejected peoples, racial gods, racial attitudes and racial prejudices. Practically all civilized humanity is now in the throes of racial upheaval. The white man regards the black man as his inferior. Throughout the southern states there is a definite color line drawn which in some cases is incalculably unjust. There are schools in the United States where the pupils, encouraged by parents of puerile intelligence, have risen in a body and refused to admit the enrollment of colored children in their classes. While the white man views with contempt the black man, he considers with ever-increasing alarm the machinations of the yellow man and the brown man. The lot of the red man apparently gives his white brother little concern, for the latter feels that the work of extermination goes on apace. It is interesting to note at this stage the effort man makes not to be inclusive, for he seems to fear lest he should learn to love everything so much that he would have nothing left to hate. The question of sex equality becomes an issue during this period, and man has undertaken to determine whether woman really has the consciousness of a human being or whether she must depend upon man for rational intelligence. We see people everywhere who function upon this level of the fourth ring. They are called broad-minded, charitable citizens with progressive ideas. In many instances they foster foreign missions and believe in spreading the white man's light throughout the dark and gloomy areas where the benighted non-Aryans reside. As Charles Erskine Scott Wood has noted, they discuss the holy war of Christendom and the unholy wars of the barbarians. They are more or less patronizing and condescending in their attitudes, feeling that by reason of their exalted status they can well afford to be nice to their less fortunate younger brothers. Such people do not compare favorably with those few outstanding examples of intelligence produced by the world. If contrasted, however, with the primitive attitudes of the first ring, their progress is apparent. These people are trying to be big, but are bound to their littleness by precedent, environment, education and fear. They dread to be on the unpopular side of any issue, yet sincerely wish that the popular side might occasionally be the right side. In ancient astrology the fourth plane, that of the sun, was regarded as a middle point dividing the inferior or subsolar planets from the superior orbs moving outside the solar orbit. It naturally follows that when the realization has been lifted to the consciousness of the fifth circle it should concern itself with greater verities. He who has reached this stage is capable of understanding the immortal words of Thomas Paine, "The world is my country and to do good is my religion." The only defect in the slogan is the lack of definite understanding regarding the word good. The ideal is an excellent one, but its fulfillment is very difficult, for good can never be discovered as long as the individual considers himself its true criterion. Having thus pierced all the rings of consciousness to the fifth, realization has now reached that point where it begins to recognize the magnitude of the plan behind manifesting life. The concerns of nations and the politics of men then recede into insignificance, for from this comparatively exalted level of realization humanity is viewed as a single unit. At this stage there also comes the realization that human life is not the only rational manifestation of deity. Consciousness and intelligence are recognized in the lower kingdoms and brotherhood extends to all corners of the earth, including all races and species without distinction. The vastness of the whole and the infinitesimal smallness of the part we call the world begins to be apparent. Upon this level philosophy begins, that is, philosophy as apart from the individualistic codes established by primitive man with no thought for that which was beyond the vista of his own comprehension. The principles of justice emerge from the codes of primitive retribution. Power becomes thoughtful of weakness and might be considerate of that which is less than itself. From the code of the survival of the fittest comes the realization that it is possible to make fit the unfit that all may survive. The subtler virtues are elevated above the grosser propensities, and grace and beauty are regarded as superior to strength. Although truth is still but a concept, the increasing realization gives the sense of magnitude which overawes and causes the half-awakened faculties to glimpse the immeasurable that lies beyond. The sage within is coming into himself, the sky wanderer is casting off the bonds which bind him to earth, the voices of the seven spheres are calling, and something far down in the depths of man's nature is tugging at its fetters, crying out for freedom to join in the ecstatic dance of life. Having raised himself to the contemplation of the world and its mystery, the sage finds himself one with the world and its mystery, his heart merged with the heart of the world, his mind teeming with the thoughts of the world, his whole being filled with the longings of the world. He ultimately reaches the state where he may truthfully say that he understands the world, for man understands what he is and is what he understands. When realization pierces the sixth ring and blends itself with the consciousness of that plane, it is declared that the individual transcends individual concerns and becomes a citizen of the universe. His kinship with the sun, the moon and the stars are established, for the consciousness that was formerly individual discovers individuality to be a limiting and binding illusion. Of such souls as have attained to this exalted state are the Bodhisattvas, those who stand at the very gateway of liberation. These exalted ones may still turn back and as elder brothers walk the dusty roads of the lower worlds, but before them the swinging veils of eternity are very thin, and the voice of the great sea of reality calls to them to immerse their lesser selves in its limitless expanse. To describe the consciousness of those so proximate to reality is a futile undertaking for anyone not so illumined. It can only be said that such as these brood over mortality and leaning from the casements of heaven regard with solicitude divine this mundane sphere. These are the great ones who walk from star to star, whose souls are so vast that the whirling bodies of the firmament are encircled by them. These are the ones who gaze straight into the face of the sun unblind. The Oriental mind conceives these illumined and perfected ones to be vast beings whose statures extend from earth to heaven, whose feet rest upon pink lotus buds and whose flowing draperies reveal in their grace the innate perfection of the wearer. Nowhere in all the mighty figure is a single incongruity to be found. The long, slender fingers either assume the mudras with perfect rhythm or hold the symbols of divine accomplishment. Surrounded by its blazing nimbus, the noble head is set in absolute repose, yet in the awesomeness of its grandeur there is nothing to inspire fear, for the perfected ones are not terrible in power but rather beautiful in humility. Though the great face of the Bodhisattva blazes like burnished gold, there is in it that sweet repose which makes all who behold it cease their strivings and enter into meditation. The jewels in the crown gleam and glisten with a holy light, and the clanking rings upon the mendicant staff sound the music of the spheres. With his feet rising from the earth in lotus cups and his head blended with the heavens, the Bodhisattva thus stands as the embodiment of those redeeming graces which, latent in most men, have been awakened and brought to full expression through the eons of preparation. The lips of the illumined are as lotus buds, for they have been perfected through ages of perfect speech, and from them issue the words of perfect wisdom. The half-closed eyes contemplate the measureless vistas in whose depths resides the perfect Buddha, and toward this ultimate that lies beyond the seventh ring the Great One thus directs the ageless chant of the law. I take my refuge in thy name and thee. I take my refuge in thy law of good. I take my refuge in thy order. Omi. It is not written that the lesser shall include the greater in its scope of awareness. It is impossible, therefore, to trace the magnitude of that illumination which, standing at the threshold of reality, already glimpses the endless. Of this consciousness all that can be said is that, robed in its own exaltedness, it awaits the day when it shall be merged with the all. At last, for the aspiring soul there comes the great day be with us which is indeed the end of all beginnings. This day, that has a dawn but no sunset, begins in time and lasts throughout eternity. Diversity has been completely absorbed and naught remains save the meditating saint and the Absolute. The iridescent bubble of being now floats upon the great ocean from whose primordial spray it was fashioned. For one breathless, unmeasurable second of time the bubble hangs suspended, an opalescent sphere. Against its confining walls the imprisoned sage hurls the blazing thunderbolt of his will. The bubble bursts and instantly disappears except for a fine mist that settles back into the endless sea. Thus is accomplished the annihilation of the last ring of illusion, when realization becomes so exalted as to be incapable of further qualification, when nothing but all is sufficient and the multitude of illusions, including the dream of existence, have been dissipated. The leering Yama, the god of illusion, who sought to grasp the bubble and its holy contents, retires discomfited, for the perfected one has escaped into the refuge that endures. No more will the illumined one walk with man. His last discourse has been given, for the last time he has taken upon himself the veil of sorrow, for he has now merged himself with the law that is his refuge. Those who seek the perfected one must search for him in perfection, for he has become one with all the good which he sought. He is identical with the beauty that he served, he is the truth whose actuality he conceived, he is the sure foundation that is the absolute necessity. To the disciples left behind, the master who passes into nirvana is one who has passed out of the world which shall cease, into the world which ceases not. He has become one with all the permanence that is, and through all the manifestations of infinite law he is revealed. He has become one with the finger that traces the sunsets upon the western sky, one with the god of morning who, parting the curtains of night, ushers in the day, one with the winds and the rains. He gazes down from the blue mists of heaven and up from the dark mystery of the earth. His voice is heard in the mantra and his eloquence in the booming of the temple gong, his strength is made manifest in the law and his meekness in the humility of the mendicant. The one gone has ceased to be somewhere but has grown to be everywhere, for he has found reality and is himself one with that which all men seek. One by one the aspiring soul has discarded the limiting rings of consciousness. From the least to the greatest he has risen, and this he has accomplished by becoming the least among the least. With one supreme effort of realization, he has renounced death and become deathless, he has willingly surrendered life and become lifeless. So, lifeless and deathless, he remains immovable in eternity. Climbing up the ladder of the stars he has followed the path to perfection, he has walked the middle road which has been established since the beginning of the world. He has followed in the footsteps of the sages gone before, and after him will come myriads yet unborn, until sometime the way to nirvana shall be the royal road by which all humanity passes from the ephemerality of mortal existence to the unchangeableness of divine existence. He who attains the Absolute is himself the Absolute, for while all men contemplate some world to which their consciousness has attuned them, he who has attained the Absolute contemplates only the inconceivable perfection of the Absolute itself. United with that which eternally endures, the perfected soul is freed forever from the illusion of change, of difference, of time and of distance. It is useless, however, to attempt an analysis of the consciousness of the one in whom consciousness has thus been merged with reality. While we struggle impotently with the tangled skein of life, such a one has gathered all its strands together and rewound the line of life to its own beginning. While we are borne upon its surface, powerless to stem its currents, such a one has reversed the waters of the river of life and caused them to flow back to their own source. Having revealed to all men through his life the fulfillment of the law and having preached his farewell sermon that all might understand, the great Buddha entered nirvana. Having by his resurrection demonstrated to all mankind the illusion of death, the Master Jesus ascended into the eons to be united with his heavenly Father. having demonstrated that justice alone shall survive. Socrates drank the hemlock and with perfect realization exchanged the death of life for the life of death. Certain of the reality that lies beyond and given courage by ever-increasing vistas of consciousness, the aspiring soul proceeds to the annihilation of the unreal by hurling himself voluntarily through the wall of his prison into the embrace of the law which is his refuge and his end. Having thus considered, in diagrammatic fashion at least, the principle involved in the unfoldment of realization, let us view the subject from the standpoint of the philosopher. If asked to describe the sensations through which he passes as he projects his realization inward toward the self, the Oriental mystic would reply that he first seats himself in the midst of the bustle and confusion of the world. Then, having established his physical body in the posture and state prescribed by the law, he begins the conscious withdrawal of himself from his outer life. Gradually the turmoil around him ceases until the physical world seems to sink away into space, leaving him alone immersed in a quasi-emptiness which is permeated, however, by the sense of protection and well-being. In its ascent realization passes through various states or conditions where, if right mindfulness is not employed, the mystic wanders off into a phantasmal world which the European magicians of the Middle Ages chose to call the sphere of the astral light. Here the sense of emptiness is no longer present, for space seems filled with strange and exotic perfumes and the one in meditation beholds flowers falling from space upon him until he is literally buried beneath a mass of sweet-smelling blossoms. Over him then steals a bliss unalloyed and the compelling urge to drift off into the astral gardens which have thus, suddenly materialized into being. As Eliphas Levi says, however, the serpent of evil is entwined about each flower and he who tarries here will never find the real. But, resolute in his defiance of the phantasms thus, conjured up by Mara, the realization of the mystic rises above all these through spheres of light and color, through plains where endless music peals as from a heavenly organ. At length all phenomena cease, light and darkness cease, the realization of the personal self ceases. Slowly over the entire being descends an absolute peace and the mystic is swept into infinite realization. At this point the sage will end his description, for here description fails. Realization is the power by which the great achievement is rendered possible. Realization, as previously stated, must not be confused with intellectual acquiescence in, or concept of an idea. Realization is the measure of accomplishment. Realization is the product of right thinking, right feeling, and right acting. Realization is not attainable except as the reaction of right doing. Only experience, renunciation, compassion, love, service and ideality can build realization and only realization is capable of elevating man through the various spheres of consciousness. Thus, are definitely set forth the way, the means, and the end, but no man can take this path for another. Diversity is the paramount illusion. Only realization can overcome the concept of diversity. A great soul is obvious from his instinctive effort to synthesize the elements of life. Take, for example, the so-called body of knowledge. That which man believes he knows he has divided into a host of subdivisions, each of which is served by intellects naturally segregative and separative. The physicist, the biologist and the anthropologist all live in worlds apart, each seeking with his own particular fragment of the body of knowledge to solve the riddle of it all. However, as consciousness reveals more and more of reality to man, all these man-made divisions disappear and the multitude of streamlets converge to form the three great rivers of science, philosophy, and religion. These, in turn, eventually empty into the one great ocean of truth. Never will knowledge be possible, however, until we realize that each part is helpless without all the others, that all branches of learning are useless until merged in a single science representing the sun of human thought, feeling, and belief. It is sad but true that with few exceptions what man thinks he knows actually stands between him and knowledge, for he who is rich in beliefs is usually a pauper in facts. The theorist is too involved in his own irrational complexities to recognize rational simplicity. Barring the individual from the path of attainment are not only the unrecognized absurdities of his own life, but also the cumulative prejudice, bigotry and false emphasis of generations. The theology of his fathers, the philosophy of his ancestors and the stupendous scientific institutions of his contemporaries all tend to overawe the individual into acceptance of the unreal. The gods are so silent and man so bombastic that ignorant mortals may well be excused if they regard the dogmatic utterances of man as more authoritative than the silence of the gods. Only after much experience with the pyrotechnics of discordant isms is the eloquence of divine silence discernible. The world is largely composed of people whose smugness is impervious, people who are orthodox in their orthodoxy and orthodox in their heterodoxy. With equal facility they defend both their plethora of beliefs and their paucity of them. Exhibiting the keenest pleasure, they conduct one through the many chambers of their minds, woefully unaware that all this vast mental establishment represents a prison and not a palace. He who would tread the path that leads to light and liberation must first cast aside not physical possessions, which, at best, are but gewgaws, but the so-called treasures of the mind, which are actually a hodgepodge of notions. Divorced from all bias and assumption, stripped of the garments of pomp and ceremony and exchanging the robes of self-satisfaction for the simple saffron garment of humility, the mendicant soul achieves by the middle road. His reliance is neither upon God nor man but upon the law. In full realization that the law of all things is ultimate perfection, the seeker after reality takes his stand upon that eternal urge which moves all to this ennobled end. Good. Beautiful. The fundamental motion of the one toward the two, and from their sum the triad is established. The triangle is the skeleton of the universe, the whole diversity of life being erected upon a threefold foundation. The complicated order of manifestation may cause the uninformed to lose sight of the unchanging three, which is indeed the God of the wise.
Thanks for watching the Wisdom Rocker. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.